Bueno, muchas gracias por esta oportunidad de discutir el brillante libro de Sergio y estar con todos ustedes. What I was going to, iba a leer un poquito y pensar algunas cosas en inglés. Basically, thinking about a somewhat minor but perhaps major aspect of this book, and what I mean is its particular account of linguistic meaning, and kind of thinking through it in terms of something that I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of Beasley Murray's post-hegemony, and in particular thinking about his claim that what matters is how things present themselves to us, not what they may represent. And obviously the move here is obvious, that it's the replacement of representation, which involves what something means, with affect, which involves how we experience it. And I guess my recurring question is whether or not from the start, that claim, what matters is how things present themselves to us, not what they represent, commits us to a vision of the world that is essentially and inescapably identitarian. Now, of course, that that book empties out in such a radical way all of the familiar, in such a kind of, radical doesn't even capture the sort of radicalness of the way it empties out, not just all this old familiar categories of Latin Americanist identitarianism, the region, region, language, etc., but even any sort of recognizable substance of identity, reconstituted bodies in flux, and of course it commits to a notion of identity that is not in its particular content, but in its sort of characteristic. Obviously, in post-hegemony, identity isn't fixed, but in a state of what Beasley Murray calls constant flux, not essentialized, but infinitely heterogeneous, not bound up with the history of popular, regional, national, linguistic, cultural, or racial identities, but instead, quote, radically open. In other words, post-hegemony seems on the surface to understand the world not in terms of identities, but rather in terms of the interaction of bodies that overflow any set identities. And then it imagines a future in which singularities and partial objects, bodies of all shapes and sizes, would be transformed into new experimental couplings and collectives. But the sort of identitarian logic of this argument, I wonder if it is found not in the way that the project substantializes identity, or in the way it conceptualizes it as embodied, performative, essential, contingent, or discursive, but instead in the way that it replaces the question of meaning with experience. And so I wanted to kind of begin by thinking about a few episodes in this book that I found particularly fascinating and challenging, because of course this book, in no less forceful and compelling way than post-hegemony, seeks to empty out what Sergio refers to as las filosofías identitarias concernidas con lo propio y lo auténtico, incluyendo las sentidas reivindicaciones neoindigenistas que, disconformes con el recorte político representacional del archivo literario latinoamericano, esa inseminación monumental producida por el discurso de la gran crítica, todavía plantean el problema de la justicia en términos de representación e inclusión en dicho archivo. So it's easy to see how Villalobos' book constitutes a forceful and even radical departure from the politics of identity and lo propio, and the logic of the Latin Americanist literary archive. But I wonder if it's harder to see a certain overlap with it. And in post-hegemony, the account of meaning that's endorsed and it sort of appears in that book, it takes the form of the most canonical one of the most canonical Latin Americanist texts, which is Escribir en el aire, right? This kind of sort of emerges as this kind of par excellence, a moment of effective reading, right? Of a kind of non-representational, non-intentional form of reading. Of course, the version of identity offered to us in Soberanías and Suspenso is very much outside of anything that would be recognizable in terms of a criollista or Latinoamericanista account of identity. And it's worth noting again the systematic way in which Sergio rejects, quote, los resabios nihilistas de la identidad, la autenticidad, la especificidad, la nación, el pueblo, y la serie infinita de categorías que estructuran a dicha imaginación al mismo tiempo que la amarran a la lógica valorativa del nihilismo. So the old regional, national, linguistic, cultural, and racial identities are gone, but I wonder if somehow replaced with identity in a kind, the logic of identity in a kind of stripped down, boiled down, essential way. And I wonder if this Latino-Americanista ghost emerges in on the one hand, the notion of anasemia, and also in a particularly anti-intentionalist, deliberately, forcefully anti-intentionalist account that Villalobos advances. So, for example, in Villalobos' discussion of the work of Patricio Marchand, he notes Marchand's claim that la poesía puede ser leída de acuerdo a su contenido explícito o intencional, lo que ésta dice de la experiencia del poeta, pero esta sería una lectura que privilegia la dimensión comunicativa del lenguaje, una lectura subordinada a la soberanía del poeta, autor, creador, genio. On the contrary, sort of in the place of this, Marchand argues for an otra lectura donde el poeta, si así pudiésemos decirlo, es hablado por el lenguaje, lo que supone la suspensión de toda relación soberana, dada la condición histórica y no gramatical de la significación. So in that moment, in that particular kind of meaning, if the reader becomes part of the text, the question of what the text means or even what it is it can only be understood as a particular function of the reader's identity or subject position, or even subject position in the most boiled down way, like where I stand, the context in which I read. And I wonder too if sort of the connection with Marchand and Marchand's investment in the ser estar polemic, which of course recalls sort of Rodolfo Cush's early connection with this in América Profunda, isn't one of the places where this starts to become more clear. And also in the discussion of the ready-mades, which I found one of the most fascinating and challenging parts of the book. And I just read a part of this, where Sergio talks about the possibility of the ready-made as something that would be a form of art beyond any intention, beyond sort of an intentional meaning, not bound to those hierarchies, and maybe it's kind of closed by thinking a little bit about the ways in which, about what it would mean to think about something like a Duchamp ready-made as an unintentional object. Because the fascinating sort of trick of the ready-made is that it's totally identical to something like the fountain is totally identical to the urinal. The only difference, and in that sense, like the fountain is like a kind of like the plastic arts, artes plásticas version of Pierre Menard, right? The only thing that's sort of added to it is literally the identification of an author. It is the R. Mutt sort of signed on it. And I guess I think that as much as it might be interesting to think about it as a kind of critique of intention, intention is the only thing that allows us to see it as a critique of intention in the first place. In other words, there are no formal properties about the fountain that suggest to us that it's anything other than a urinal, except the identification of an author, except the identification of an intention. And there are ways, I guess, where we could sort of think around this, where we think, well, it's actually its place in the museum, right, that makes us read it, right, and not just see it as some kind of representation of something. But I guess I wonder if that's not ultimately just another way of kind of positing intention. And so I guess the sort of bigger question that I struggle with, but that what I kind of find endlessly fascinating here is the question of whether the critique of representation and a particular account of meaning that is non-intentional basically kind of brings us back to a bare bones, boiled down logic of identity, on the one hand, or a kind of logic that's much closer to Fukuyama's The End of History, and another, in which you know, if we disagree about meaning, what a text means, we don't see, we don't appeal to our subject position, right? Because in that moment we sort of believe that what it means is something somewhat outside ourselves. But if we have a participating author, if we think of sort of affect, if we think of it as non-representational, any sort of versions of this, I guess we have to, these things become a function of our identity. So we move from kind of like the logic of ideological conflict to a logic of social groups and identities in some kind of way, right? Because if once we sort of give up on the idea that the fountain is representing something, or that a text is representing something, we just have our experience of it, and we can no longer disagree. We just have my subject position and yours. So anyway, but I'll end there and not go over my time. But well.